Hello, everyone. This is Dr. Kingston, and in this video, we are going to be talking about cranial nerves. Now, as you begin studying cranial nerves, the first thing you're going to notice if you open up a textbook or pull up something on Google is that there's a practically endless amount of information out there about them. And this is because they do a lot. They provide all the innervation for your head and a little bit of the neck. For today, though, I really want to scale back on some of that detailed information overload and really just focus on the basics. So by the time you are done with this session here, I want you to have learned their name, their number, what kind of innervation they're carrying, so what is their modality, and be able to identify the general regions that they innervate. Okay, we'll talk a little bit about which carry some parasympathetic fibers, which are a special type of autonomic or unconscious innervation as well. Now, I do just want to caution you here that the information that I'm covering in this video is just a foundation, all right? This is not the be-all, end-all of what you need to know about the cranial nerves going forward in this course. This is just the foundation that we're going to be building on as we move into specific regions and learn more details about the cranial nerves, their pathways, and the structures that they innervate. So keep in mind, as you come back to this material to study, that you should be adding in those details to your cranial nerve framework as we go through the course. All right, with that in mind, let's start off with a few general facts about cranial nerves. Each cranial nerve has both a name and a number. They're numbered in the order that they come off the brain and brainstem from anterior to posterior. So way over here is cranial nerve number 1, 2, 3, 4, and we can follow these all the way back to number 12 at the back. There are 4 types of neurons that travel as part of cranial nerves. And as we're going to see, each nerve carries a unique blend of these. So these types of fibers are, number 1, somatic sensory. Somatic, the word, comes from the Latin root soma, which means body. And in anatomy, we use this term specifically to refer to the outer body wall of the trunk, the limbs, and the head. So these are sensory neurons that travel between structures like the skin or muscles and the brain. We typically think of the sensation that these carry as being tactile or touch sensation, but it also includes pain and temperature sensations. All right, our next type is special sensory. And if somatic sensory was tactile, the special sensory covers everything else. All right, so these are things like olfaction or smell, vision, taste, hearing, and equilibrium. They all fit in this category. All right, somatic motor is similar to somatic sensory in that they're both innervating those same body wall, limb, and head structures, all right? The motor neurons, though, just like their name says, they're going to be providing motor innervation to the striated muscles that move these different body parts around. All right, and last but not least here is parasympathetic motor innervation. You have an entire video dedicated to parasympathetic motor innervation and its structure. So for here, I am just going to mention that parasympathetics are an autonomic nervous system, meaning that these are an unconscious control system. All right, they supply visceral structures typically, like the organs of the thorax and in the abdomen. In the head and neck, its range gets extended a little bit further outward, and it supplies secretomotor innervation to a number of mucus and salivary glands in the head. Autonomic nerves use a 2-neuron chain to reach structures outside of the central nervous system. So we might see some nerves carrying the first of these, which is the preganglionic neuron, some carrying the second in this chain. For this video, and because you have that entire other video dedicated to parasympathetics, we're just going to talk about nerves that are carrying preganglionic neurons, because those originate from the brainstem with specific nerves. So we will talk about those. Now we'll talk about which nerves are carrying the second neuron in that chain when we talk about parasympathetic nerves at large. Now that you have some idea of what cranial nerves are and what they're carrying, I'm going to walk you through all 12 of them, and we'll talk about specifics for each. So, like I said before, each cranial nerve carries its own combination of innervation modalities. Some of these are much simpler than others, and cranial nerve number 1, the olfactory nerve, is an example of a very simple mixture. It is only carrying special sensory neurons that carry smell sensation back from the superior part of the nasal cavity. So you can see its territory here outlined for you in green, and the small fibers that you see within that green will travel back up through the ethmoid bone to this bulb structure that you can see over here, and that will carry those fibers back along this tract and into the brain. Cranial nerve number 2, the optic nerve, is also a strictly special sensory nerve, and this time it's carrying back optical information from the retina of the eye. The oculomotor nerve, or cranial nerve number 3, also serves the eye, but in a little bit different way. It carries somatic motor innervation to 4 out of the 6 extraocular muscles that pull the eye into different positions within the orbit, and then it carries parasympathetic motor to some of the intrinsic muscles that make up the eyeball. These are muscles like the ciliary muscle that changes the shape of the lens, and the sphincter pupillae that narrows the pupil diameter. Cranial nerve 4, the trochlear nerve, is a purely somatic motor nerve. So just like cranial nerves 2 and 3, it is also going to enter the orbit, but it only serves the superior oblique extraocular muscle. The trigeminal nerve, cranial nerve number 5, as you can see here in the diagram, is a big one. And it is so big because it's carrying somatic sensory fibers that serve the entire face and a big portion of the head. So all of the touch sensation that you generate when you poke your face or you pull on your ear, all of that is carried back to the brain via a branch of the trigeminal nerve. Now, that is a big territory. So the trigeminal splits into 3 divisions that head to different regions. So 2 of these, and we frequently refer to these as V number to designate a division. So V1 and V2, the ophthalmic and the maxillary divisions, those carry just somatic sensory fibers. V3, or the mandibular division, and I will note here too that we do switch between division and nerve. So the mandibular division and the mandibular nerve are the same thing. V3 also carries some somatic motor fibers for a very specific set of muscles that we use to masticate or chew. Now, when I say that these divisions split up to serve different territories, this is what I mean. What you're looking at here is a type of a map of nerve territories called a dermatome. And what you see is where the branches of each of these divisions are primarily responsible for the supply are separated by color. So V1's territory here is in green, so it's this area extending up superiorly. It's including the roof of the nose and the upper eyelid, and all the way back up onto the top of the head. V2 is down here in blue, and it includes the nostrils, the upper lip, and the lower eyelid as it extends up on to the side of the face here. And finally, V3, mandibular nerve, is shown in red. So it gets the lower lip and chin, and then it gets this patch of skin kind of heading up the side of the head. Now, this looks a little funny, but remember how V3 was the odd man out? It was the only division that was also carrying some somatic motor fibers. Those somatic motor fibers are for the muscles of mastication, which sit right here. They move the jaw around, so here's the top of the jaw, here's where all those muscles are sitting. So while V3 is supplying somatic motor to these muscles, it is also supplying somatic sensory to the skin that sits over the top of it. Cranial nerve number 6 is the abducens nerve. This is another simple little nerve. It's carrying purely somatic motor innervation to one little extraocular muscle. That's the lateral rectus extraocular muscle. Cranial nerve number 7, or the facial nerve, kind of makes up for some of the simplicity of these earlier nerves, though. It carries a number of different types of innervation, including special taste sensory, somatic motor, and parasympathetic motor. The facial nerve has a pretty substantial parasympathetic component. So back in grad school, I used to joke that the facial nerve makes me cry, but it literally does that for everyone because it innervates the lacrimal gland. It actually carries most preganglionic parasympathetics that end up going to most of the glands of the face in some way. All right, this includes all of the little mucus glands in the nasal cavity and on the palate, and 2 out of the 3 major salivary glands. So if there's a gland that is making your face wet in some way, there's a pretty high probability that it's innervated by the facial nerve. The somatic motor portion of the nerve, though, is actually where it takes its name from. The motor branches here serve the muscles of facial expression, which are little muscles that sit just deep to the skin and pull that skin into different configurations. So sometimes this is for nonverbal communication, pulling faces. Sometimes it's for more practical things like keeping your lips closed while you chew. But you can see here on the image how these muscles of facial expression sit on the face, right? They're covering a lot of territory. So the facial nerve then emerges from this big gland here, and it sends out a large number of squiggly little branches to meet all of these. Cranial nerve 8, the vestibulocochlear nerve, is named exactly for where it's going. It's going to the vestibule and the cochlea of the inner ear. It carries special sensation from the inner ear, which includes both hearing and equilibrium. The glossopharyngeal nerve, cranial nerve number 9, is another mixed modality nerve. It carries special taste sensation from the posterior tongue and then somatic sensation from the same region and then extending all the way back into the pharynx. It carries just a tiny little bit of somatic motor just for the stylopharyngeus muscle. And then also carries some parasympathetic motor for the parotid salivary gland. So there's that one salivary gland that's not innervated by facial nerve. The glossopharyngeal nerve enters into the pharynx by traveling on the surface of the stylopharyngeus muscle. Now, this photo here can be a little bit tricky to understand. What we're looking at here is the posterior side of the pharynx, so the posterior aspect of your throat, basically. What you see here is the vertebral column, and you see it again over here. We have zipped that right down the middle and opened it up to get this view. All right, so here's the glossopharyngeal nerve here, and here's the stylopharyngeus muscle it rides on as it enters into the pharynx. So remember how this guy was the only one that got motor innervation from the glossopharyngeal nerve? This is why. Sitting right on top of it, might as well drop it a few fibers. At this point, then, the glossopharyngeal nerve enters into the pharynx, and it participates in a big plexus of fibers here and supplies somatic sensory innervation to the structures inside. And now for the true overachiever of the cranial nerve crowd. Cranial nerve number 10, or the vagus nerve, carries a little bit of everything. Its somatic targets are primarily in the pharynx and larynx, but its parasympathetic fibers extend all the way down into the thorax and abdomen and innervate the viscera there. To reach the pharynx and larynx, the vagus descends the neck near the common carotid artery. So here is your common carotid artery, and here is that vagus nerve traveling down there. It gives off, I'm going to switch over to this picture here now. It gives off some sensory fibers here to the superior larynx and then continues down into the thorax. Now, you can't see the thorax in this picture because it's been removed. But the level we're sitting at down here is where the great vessels are coming off the heart. So here's the aorta, and here's some of the branches coming off of it. Now, this vagus nerve, as it comes down here, does something a little funny. It gives off another branch that is destined back up the larynx, even though the larynx is now way up here. And what it does is it turns and it wraps around these big vessels to head back. I'm sorry, I think I was tracing it the wrong way. It wraps around these big vessels here to travel back up and enter the larynx from an inferior standpoint. Kind of a funny way to go about it, but no one ever said that cranial nerves had to behave logically. Cranial nerve number 11 is the accessory nerve, and it is a purely somatic motor nerve. It supplies two muscles that we find in the neck, the sternocleidomastoid and the trapezius. And finally, cranial nerve 12 is the hypoglossal nerve, and it is also carrying purely somatic motor fibers. That hypo means below, and glosso refers to the tongue. So the hypoglossal nerve approaches these muscles of the tongue from an inferior position to provide them with somatic motor innervation. And that brings us to the end of the material and to our review question. So for your question here, which cranial nerve carries somatic sensory fibers out of the choices provided here? Hopefully selected D, the trigeminal nerve. Of these, the trigeminal nerve is the only one carrying somatic sensory. It carries the bulk of somatic sensory fibers from the face back to the brain. There are a few other nerves that we will find as we go along that do carry some somatic sensory as well, but none of them carry nearly as much as the trigeminal does. All right, that is going to bring us to the end here. Thank you for joining me.